Hello pals and welcome to a new video. This week I read Burmese Days by George Orwell, so let's go ahead and talk about it. The way I've kind of planned this out is that I'm briefly going to touch on my plans for rereading all of George Orwell this year. Then a quick plot summary. I'm not going to do any spoilers, expectations on this novel, and then my thoughts on the novel. If you've ever read Burmese Days, I would love to know what you thought of it, because there's not a lot of reviews on YouTube out there or kind of articles, essays that I can track down on this. So I would love to hear from you in the comments. So this year I am working through all of George Orwell in publication order, and that is fiction, non-fiction, and then potentially some collected essays. Now I have read a fair bit of George Orwell before, but always quite sporadically across like a number of years. I first read 1984 when I was a teenager, and I've read it 2 or 3 times in total. His earlier novels, Burmese Days, A Clergyman's Daughter, and Coming Up for Air, I've not read, whereas I have read Keep the Aspidistra Flying, 1984, and Animal Farm. Late last year, before I had this YouTube channel, I read his collected essays. A fair few of them I've read before. Also, earlier this year, I read a fantastic book called Who is Big Brother by DJ Taylor, which is a reader's guide to George Orwell. And so this year, like I said, I'll be reading all of his books in chronological order. Now, the first book in rough chronological order, and the first book that was published is Down and Out in Paris in London. I'm waiting for that to come in from the library, and it's not due in until June, so I went ahead and read Burmese Days. Obviously, you can probably tell from this project that I really love George Orwell. He is one of my like North Star authors who I always come back to, who has stayed with me for like over like decade now, or more than that, over 2 decades, because I'm getting a little bit old. So as you can probably tell, I really admire him. I'm more familiar with his later work than his earlier work, and I really wanted to go ahead in this year and fill in the gaps of what I'm missing. I'm doing the same with some other authors that I really like, or I have plans to anyway. I want to do something similar with Anthony Trollope, with Muriel Spark, with Nancy Mitford. So I have a lot of little things going on. In terms of my expectations going into this, I'm really curious to read the earlier work, and I'm really excited to get to them. I have been viewing them as not a means to an end, but a really interesting point to see his evolution towards 1984 and Animal Farm. However, when I started this, I knew within the first few pages, I mentioned in my last video, which was a spring book haul and catch up, I knew within the first few pages that I was absolutely going to adore this. And spoiler for my thoughts on this book, I really liked this. Stylistically, this is very Edwardian. I can't remember the quote, but there's a quote about George Orwell that basically says he's a revolutionary in love with like 1901. This is very Edwardian in style, in writing style, in tone. It's also obviously set in Burma or British India, who ruled over Burma at the time. It's set in the 1920s and was written by George Orwell in 1934. I think part of the reason why I connected with this almost immediately is because one of my favourite novels of all time by one of my like top 5 writers is A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. These are very similar, obviously, in terms of like subject. There's really interesting parallels between the friendship between some of the characters in both books. But yeah, this is a topic that I'm really interested in. Late last year, I also read The Making of a Marchioness by Frances Hodgson Burnett. That touches on a similar subject too. So Anglo-India and British India is just generally something that I find absolutely fascinating. Earlier this year, I read this book, Him as Big Brother, A Reader's Guide to George Orwell. I actually finished this a few weeks ago because I read the bulk of it before I moved house. In this book, DJ Taylor describes 1984 and in fact every George Orwell novel as a revolution that fails, a rebel that returns to base, compelled to acknowledge the error of their ways. That is basically the summary to every George Orwell novel. In all of his earlier works and in the most kind of well-known works, that is kind of what we're dealing with, and that's very true for Burmese Days. A brief kind of plot summary to Burmese Days. Burmese Days is set in the Burman town of Chakdadar in the 1920s. The heart and the kind of physical centre of the novel is a European club in Chakdadar that the kind of officials within the town frequent. It's focused on quite a close community of British officials within that town. I think maybe there's like 7 or 8 of them in total. We follow Flory, who is an English timber merchant, and he's lived in Burma for quite a long time by the time that we meet him, for over a decade, and over time he has befriended a Indian doctor called Dr. Veeraswamy. In this novel, both Flory and the doctor become embroiled in the kind of plots and schemes of a corrupt Burmese official called Yu Po Kin. Also in Chakdadar are a very typical Anglo Indian couple called the Lacasteens. The Lacasteens' niece Elizabeth comes to live with them after the death of her mother. She travels from Paris to Chakdadar to live with them. She is much younger than Flory. She's in her early 20s, and she has been living in a kind of genteel poverty, and really her only out from that is to marry. One of the things that I love but is frustrating but in an intentional way in Burmese Days is that almost every single character in this novel is irredeemable. They're all unlikable. You don't really have anybody to root for. Now, that is definitely intentional. Both the British and the Burmese characters in this novel are all tarnished by the all kind of pervading colonial system. They're all touched by it, and it affects their inner selves and their outer relationships. Flory, who is our main character, our hero, in quotation marks, he, like I said, is a timber merchant. He keeps a Burmese mistress, Mala May. He is the most sympathetic and the most forward-thinking in his views of empire in the novel. He probably most closely aligns with George Orwell's views of the colonial system. However, he is the most frustrating character. He is self-pitying, he is awkward, he is cruel, especially to Mala May. He regularly does things to debase himself. He drinks too much, he uses prostitutes. Throughout the novel, he describes himself as being corrupted by the place that he is in, Burma. Although he is financially dependent on staying, he went out to British India to essentially make a good amount of money. He falls in love, you learn this really early on, and it wouldn't be any surprise, with Elizabeth Lacasteen, mainly because he sees in her the chance of redemption rather than anything specifically about her. Constantly throughout this misreading her, and it leads to some of the most cringe-inducing scenes, which are really well done by George Orwell. The friendship between Flory and Dr. Veeraswamy, who is probably the character in the book that you can root for the most. They are friends, but they're not aligned in sympathies. They never truly connect on like an intellectual level, and I don't think it would ever be possible for them to. That's kind of the point. It really reminded me, like I mentioned, of the friendship between Dr. Aziz and Fielding in A Passage to India. I have to say that Ian Forster goes into that in much more depth, and it's much more nuanced. But if you like this, potentially this could be the book for you, and vice versa. Partway through the novel, Elizabeth Lacasteen comes to Chakdadar. Like I said, she's been living in kind of like a middle-class genteel poverty, which is a theme that always comes up in interwar novels, Edwardian novels. Her aunt makes it clear to her that actually she has to marry, and she has to marry soon, because they cannot kind of keep her in the house. She has previously been living with her mother in Paris. Her mother is an artist, and she's really come to detest what she considers to be the highbrow. Parts of her story are quite dark, especially her relationship with her uncle. There is a sense in this book that you get, and it's kind of all pervasive, is this sense that everything, all the characters and the place are just really quite sordid. One of the key scenes between Elizabeth and Florey is when they go hunting, they game hunting. It eventually escalates into something much bigger. If you've ever read any of George Orwell's essays, I have in front of me his collected essays, and you're familiar with shooting an elephant or a hanging, you will notice the influence straight away in this, which is one of the things that I wanted to touch on this in terms of my thoughts. This, from having read kind of a lot of George Orwell's essays, journalism, non-fiction, very much is heavily influenced by his time in Burma. He was he worked for the British Indian police force in Burma, I think between 1922 and 1927. And this is clearly really heavily influenced by that. If you've read those essays, like I mentioned, you will immediately recognise the substance and the tone and the style in this. This novel, I would say, is also a vehicle for George Orwell's critique of colonialism throughout his non-fiction work, and in this he was very forward-thinking, again, I guess like Florey, in his kind of views on empire, on how corrupting the system is. Shooting an Elephant is one of the best essays for that, because that shows how the system is corrupting to British India, but also to the English in British India. One of the big themes of this is how repressive society is in Chakdadar, and there's some really interesting ways that he does that in terms of the extreme heat, the quite closed, small community, basing the novel in the heart of the European club. Florey explains to Elizabeth what it's been like for him living in Burma, and he explains it as to live silent, alone, consoling oneself in secret, sterile worlds. For Florey, that is highbrow books and prostitutes and drinking too much. One of the things that I absolutely loved about this is just how beautiful the writing is in this. It's so descriptive on the flora and the nature of Burma, on the flowers and the rivers and the trees and the landscape. There's some truly beautiful passages in here. I have my eye on a book by Rebecca Solnit called George Orwell's Roses. George Orwell was really into flowers and plants, and I can't wait to read that after kind of seeing just how much detail he goes into this. Goes into in this. I think he's said in one of his essays that two of the characteristics of the British is how gentle they are and how much they love flowers. So that was just such wonderful touches in this. Like I said, this is really stylistically Edwardian, and I think that that's really interesting, because I know that and I think a lot of people, when you think of George Orwell, especially Animal Farm in 1984, you think of how ahead of their time they were, of how advanced in their thinking and their ideas and the warnings that they presented. But in his heart, George Orwell, well, he is an Edwardian, and so Edwardians, the Edwardian period is one of my favourite for novels. In substance, way ahead of its time, but in style, like I said, really quite traditional. When you think of his contemporaries, would be like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf. This, I think, was considered quite old-fashioned at the same time, and I think potentially this was rejected by T.S. Eliot, who also rejected Down and Out in Paris and London. Also, one of the things that I loved about this is all of the literary references in this. He mentions Dickens and Tacitus. There's just so many, because Florey is into his highbrow reading, which Elizabeth really dislikes. He drops those references in, and it's just fantastic to see. In George Orwell's essays, let me get the essay collection actually. In George Orwell's essays, I have the George Orwell Selected Essays and Oxford World Classics. I also have some other ones, but in this edition we have essays on Charles Dickens, on P.G. Wodehouse, on Henry Miller. I know he started an essay on Evelyn Waugh when he was very ill with TB, which he eventually died of. Some of his essays on writers, if you can get hold of them and you love those writers, are absolutely fantastic. I love the Dickens one, and I really recommend the Woodhouse one too. One of the things that I didn't know, which I discovered from reading Who is Big Brother, is that George Orwell was planning a new Burma novel when he was essentially on his deathbed, when he was dying of tuberculosis, and that was going to be called The Smoking Room Story, which was going to be set in Burma. I think he started it and roughly outlined it. I would have loved to have read that, because I had such a fantastic time reading this. He died so young, in his early 40s, kind of like Jane Austen, where we're just missing so much work that we could have had. So yeah, I just really like this. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is perfect. I don't think it is, but I think for your first novel, this is a really interesting piece of work. And yeah, I have next up in terms of novels is A Clergyman's Daughter, but like I said, I want to read them in publication order, so I'll be heading to Down and Out in Paris and London. Like I said, if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, or if you've read any other kind of George Orwell, especially his earlier novels. That's going to be it for today. I'm currently reading Jane Austen's bookshelf and having an absolutely fantastic time, and I've read some great literary biographies recently, including this one, and so I think potentially for my next video I might do some literary biography recommendations, maybe like 3 or 4, and then also talk you through what I have on my TBR for literary biographies, because I have accumulated quite a lot recently. And then next weekend I was thinking of doing a bank holiday kind of reading vlog, because I have a good few days off work and my plan is to just crack on with my reading. Right, I hope you're all having a lovely day whenever you're watching this, and I will speak to you all soon. Bye!